Good morning. It is good to be here with you as always. I hope that what we can do here this morning will be pleasing to God and helpful to you. Bit of housekeeping before I get started. Some of you have heard this, and I want to say this for a different reason. I've been having some mental issues the last couple of weeks, especially this past week. And so I'm scheduled to go at some point for an MRI regarding those things. So what I wanted to say about that is if I suddenly say something that doesn't make any sense, you'll know why. I'll at least have an excuse if that's the case. Hopefully everything will be fine and there won't be any problems. I want to start out by giving you this little quote from a poet who once wrote, "In matters controversial, my perception's rather fine. I always see both points of view, the one that's wrong and mine." And that's a very succinct way of saying that we often have our perceptions, don't we? We have things that color those perceptions. Sometimes we have difficulties sorting all of that out. And today we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go through the lesson. I want you to think first as we do so on three quotes. The first quote is from a fellow named Bertrand Russell. Some of you might know who that is. I think he was a philosopher. Once I read the quotes, you'll know what kind of philosopher he was. But he said this: religion is something left over from the infancy of our intelligence. It will fade away as we adopt reason and science as our guidelines. So you know obviously where he's coming from in that particular respect. A second one who might be more familiar to you is Richard Dawkins, who says faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. And the last quote is from a fellow named Tim Minchin. You might know who that is, maybe. No? Heard the name. I think he's a musician of sorts, maybe a comic musician of sorts. Somehow he got into the fray on this subject, and I don't know why. Science adjusts its views based on what's observed. Faith is the denial of observation so that belief can be preserved. And so we understand the perspective that all three of those quotes are coming from, right? We understand the idea that there is a perception there that religion is obviously subservient. We shouldn't pay any attention to it. We're more enlightened now. We understand more. And so therefore, we're going to ignore those things and we're going to concentrate on those things which we believe make sense in terms of science and reason and those sorts of things. What do all of these quotes have in common, though, in terms of what we want to talk about this morning? Well, they commit a crime. All three of them commit a crime, and that crime is a crime of logical fallacy. That's what we want to talk about this morning. Logical fallacy. What is a logical fallacy, you ask? Well, if we understand that logic is the art of thinking and reasoning justly, according to the 1828 Webster's Dictionary, which I want to use primarily, and if we understand that a fallacy is a deception, then what we have, therefore, is a mistake in reasoning. A mistake in reasoning. That's what we're looking at this morning. And what we want to do is look at a particular one, because I certainly can't look at every single mistake in reasoning that human beings make. But we do want to look at one in particular this morning and talk about it in regards to this idea of a logical fallacy and committing a logical fallacy. This particular one that we want to look at this morning is called by various names. I think the one that I've kind of gravitated to is the fallacy of the excluded middle. And I don't know if any of you have ever really delved into these subjects very much, but obviously logic and these sorts of things are very much studied. People look at these things and study them and try to come up with understandings of how people commit logical fallacies. So the one that I've kind of gravitated to is the fallacy of the excluded middle. And hopefully we'll explain what that means as we go. But there are other names for it too. One of the other names is black and white. And that probably is the one that is most easily descriptive of what the problem is. Some people call it a false dilemma, a false choice, or a false dichotomy. Now, I want to make one thing clear as we go through this, and that is we're not talking about the same thing as the law of contradiction or the law of non-contradiction. Aristotle defined the law of non-contradiction in metaphysics as this idea: there cannot be an intermediate between contradictions, but of one subject we must either affirm or deny any one predicate. And that comes directly from Aristotle in terms of his logic and his thinking. In other words, really what that means is this: I can't be standing up here preaching the lesson at the same time that I'm sitting in the audience. We understand that that's impossible, right? Unless somehow I've developed a time machine or I have some other power that you don't know about. Maybe one that I'd really like to have, and that might be the Flash. I'd like to be the Flash. And so I could probably be sitting here at the same time. You wouldn't notice the difference, right? But that's the idea that comes from really the law of non-contradiction. We can't have two things that are the same at the same time in the same place. And so we're not going to think about that at this particular time. We're going to move on from that idea. We're not talking about that particular idea. And as kind of an example, I guess, when Jesus asked the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 21 and verse 25, the baptism of John, where was it from? From heaven or from men? That's an example of what we would consider to be the law of non-contradiction. There are only two possibilities. Either the idea came from men or it came from God. And we understand that in so many ways in terms of our reasoning and logic ourselves, right? We understand that that's the way that it is. There is no middle ground in that particular argument. Even the Pharisees acknowledged that there were only two choices to that particular situation. So this argument is presented as having only two choices. And that really is where the fallacy comes in. It's presented as having only two choices. Either what we have is an either or scenario. So we have either A or B is true, A is not true, therefore B is true. And that's the only way that we can look at this particular thing. The problem is, remember, this is a fallacy. This is an error in logic, right? This is a misunderstanding. False dichotomies are logical fallacies because they present two mutually exclusive options as the only two possible options. Now, you're starting to get the understanding here that there's where we commit our problem, isn't it? We commit our problem when we assume that there are only two possibilities in this. There are only two things that can exist simultaneously. And the problem is that's not true. Let me give you some examples of logical fallacies that you'll recognize. One of them is America, love it or leave it. That's an example of a logical fallacy. It's an error in logic. Are we thinking that the only two possibilities that can exist in that particular situation are we either love America or we leave America? That's what has to exist in that particular situation. Here's another one. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Is that true? Is that always true in every situation? That's the way that we are given to understand this particular logical fallacy. One that would strike more to home for us is you either believe in science or you believe in the Bible. Is that true? You can only believe one or the other, right? That's the way it has to be. You can only believe what, pick your side, right? Here's one that some of us might like. Either you like kids or you don't like kids, right? It has to be one or the other. So which is it going to be? Well, I guess I'm just going to choose not to like kids. So that's just kind of the way that I'm going. Some people might like an environmental angle to this. If you do not support a certain environmental policy, then you're not for clean air or clean water. You see how this works. You see how the idea works, right? The logical fallacy of it is that we have to accept a particular situation as being the only one or one of two. One that I like to, the answer is a little more obscure on this, but I just think it's funny. I always have thought it's funny. Um, Jack, have you stopped beating your wife? Right? That's a logical fallacy, right? Now, in fact, in that particular instance, Jack can't win, right? We understand that Jack can't win that particular situation. If he says, yes, I've stopped beating my wife, then we know, of course, that he used to beat his wife, and that's no good. And if Jack says no, well, then he's obviously still beating his wife, and we can't have that, can we? So, what we see in this is really the idea that people can become trapped because of a misunderstanding in logic. And that's really what we find in this particular situation. This misunderstanding in logic leads us to come to a conclusion that says this is the only conclusion we can come to. It's got to be this one or this one. There are no other alternatives. There's no other way to look at this particular situation. According to an aptly named website called yourlogicalfallacyis.com, if you ever want to know about logical fallacies, that would be a place to go. They tell us this: this insidious tactic has the appearance of forming a logical argument, but under closer scrutiny, it becomes evident that there are more possibilities than the either or choice that is presented, right? Binary black or white thinking doesn't allow for the many different variables, conditions, and contexts in which there would exist more than just two possibilities put forth. It frames the argument misleadingly and obscures rational, honest debate. And that's where we come in. Because now, when we start to understand the points that we've made so far, one of them being the idea that there is such a thing as logical reality, right? There is such a thing as that. And we can sort of sort those things out. Then we can also start to think about the idea that this fallacy is in our own thinking sometimes, in our own thinking and our own reasoning. It may be in people we deal with, which is oftentimes the case, isn't it? That part of what we deal with is people who are trying to maneuver us into a logical fallacy. And maybe in some cases, they have maneuvered themselves into a logical fallacy. Let's look at three logical fallacies that Jesus had to deal with. They're not very complicated, but they do illustrate the point. The first one is John chapter 1. I'm sorry. See there, this is what I'm dealing with. It's not John chapter 1. It's John chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. And this is the account of the man who was born blind, right? And so in those first two verses, what we have is this. Now, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. Oh, I finally realized where my cufflink went. Well, sorry about that. I was wondering where that went. Sorry, I'll start over again. John chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. Now, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Do you see that this is a construct? This is something that has been made up in a certain situation. It's been kind of described in a certain way so as to put certain constrictions on it. And this is the idea of the point here is that the man who was born blind from birth, either he sinned or his parents sinned. That has to be what happens either way, right? There cannot be any other choice. There cannot be any other possibility. But the reality is, as we think about this, when we think about these two choices, can the man himself have sinned? Can this man have sinned? Well, no, he can't have sinned. I mean, he can have sinned if we look at it that way and think about it the way that many people do. But the reality is, he was in his mother's womb. There's no way that he could have committed a sin in his mother's womb or from his mother's womb. And so it wasn't the man himself who sinned. There's no doubt about that. What about his parents? Did his parents sin? Well, maybe if they stuck him in the eye with a sharp stick or something, it might be that they had something to do with it. But the reality of what we see here is that the parents didn't have anything to do with it. The man himself did not have anything to do with it. Jesus clearly says in chapter 9, verse 3, Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him." There's a third choice. There's a third option, right? The reality is that we are not limited to those two particular options that are being chosen there. There is another option being given to us. And this is the option that Jesus has chosen, that the works of God may be displayed in him. There's a reason for what happened to this man. And the reason was that God was showing his power through this man, exemplifying the fact that he could be healed. Note that Jesus is not denying the sin in the lives of the parents or the son, but he is denying that that was the reason for the blindness. That's why he was born blind, at least in this particular instance. The second occasion, Luke chapter 20, verses 21 and 22. And this one you know very well. Then they asked him, saying, "Teacher, we know that you say and teach rightly, and you do not show personal favoritism, but teach the way of God in truth." See that all that flowery, buttery language that we've got going on. We know there's a problem already because they're trying to butter him up. He says, "Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Well, see, what are the two choices? There are only two choices, right? Either we pay taxes to Caesar or we don't pay taxes to Caesar. Those are the only two choices that we have available to us, right? That's the way that it's being set up. And Jesus clearly says, "I'm not going to accept your premise." He says, or we read in 23 and to 25, "But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, 'Why do you test me? Show me a denarius. Whose image and inscription does it have?' They answered and said, 'Caesar's.' And he said to them, 'Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.'" You see, there's another way of looking at this particular situation. It's not simply saying either or, you have to pick one alternative or the other. You have no other option. You can choose another option. In this particular case, certainly Jesus found the middle ground, right? He found the way to deal with this particular situation, right? You can do both in essence. You can, live by what Caesar says, and you can live by what God says, because they are not necessarily the same thing. They're not necessarily on the same path. And so in that particular instance, as with the first one, we see that we're not going to allow this pigeonholing to happen. In the third example, Matthew chapter 22, verse 23, this one's a little bit more obscure maybe to understand, but it comes down to the same thing. In this particular section, the same day, the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him and asked him a question, right? They asked him this particular question. And so we know what their perspective is, right? They say there is no resurrection. So in verse 28, "Therefore in the resurrection, whose wife of the seven will she be? For all had her." Well, in that particular instance, we know what's going on. We know what's happening. This woman was married to a man. The man died. So she was married to the next man, on down the line, through seven of them. And that does present a problem, doesn't it? It is a reasonable question to ask, in the sense that when we look at the resurrection, we think about the resurrection, what do we come across? We come across this particular situation of a woman who was married to seven different men. How do we really understand that? How do we rationalize that? And the reality is, even though there is a motive problem here, and we understand that. Jesus is not necessarily condemning these people for asking these questions. Um, Ultimately, to some degree, we have to understand the questions. We have to be able to deal with the questions. And he knows what the truth is, right? I think in this particular case, in the third example here that we have, we understand that there is a little bit of an issue here in terms of somebody trying to do something nefarious. So this fallacy might be hard to see as it is presented by the Sadducees, but it's really a choice between no resurrection or the woman's being married to the brothers in the resurrection. You only have two choices. Which choice is it going to be? Are you going to be married to seven different men in the resurrection, or is there going to be no resurrection? There can only be two choices, right? If that's the way you're going to pursue this. And Jesus clearly states that they've made an error in logic. In Matthew chapter 22, verses 29 and 30, Jesus answered and said to them, "You are mistaken, not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven." So Jesus clearly says you've made a mistake in logic. We understand that that's the case. And that's what we're really dealing with. And all of these things, we're talking about problems with logic and understanding logic. And so Jesus says, you've made a mistake in this particular instance. You don't know the power of God. In the resurrection, they don't marry. They do not marry. So there is no question here. There is no problem here. There is no marriage in the resurrection. So there is a middle ground. There is an understanding of this that allows for us not to take the two choices that are offered to us. And that's really what we're dealing with here as we look at this. It's the idea that there are going to be people who come to you, there are going to be people who present to you certain ideas, and those ideas could be of any kind. And I'm sure that you've dealt with this. I'm sure you've had to deal with these sorts of things many times. When you talk to people, certainly you're going to come up against the idea that they're going to say to you, well, what do you believe? Do you believe this or this? And if we submit to that, if we allow ourselves to be put into that box, that's when we have the problem. Now, just as kind of a side note, I think I've mentioned this here before, but there's a book called Tactics. I think that I've mentioned that. Greg Kuchel's book. And I really like that book. If you have not read that, I would again recommend that book. It's a good book. And it talks about some of these logical problems. It talks about the way that some people think about these particular problems. And what we come up with here in Kuchel's book is there are two possibilities. You could say that in one of those cases, the first case, you could say, how do you handle that particular situation? How do you handle these particular situations? And the situation that he presents is you have two questions. He calls them the Columbo question. And basically, one is how do you understand that particular situation? And the second one is how did you come to that conclusion? And so there are two questions that we kind of ask. And so when we're thinking about situations with people that we have to deal with from time to time, and we are going to have to deal with people, when we come up against those particular situations, it's helpful to understand what we're going to be dealing with, that we're going to be dealing with people presenting us logical fallacies that are not necessarily genuine in terms of what they present. And so we can respond to those issues of Kuchel's by not necessarily answering the question. And that for me has been an eye opener. That for me has been a huge eye opener. I think if you're like me, maybe you're not like me, but at least in this respect, I am certainly this way. I've always been this way, even long before I became a preacher. If there was a question that somebody had for me, I was going to answer the question. It was just natural. It's just the way that it is, right? You have a question, I'll help you answer the question. I'll do the best I can, try to answer that question. And one of the things that Kuchel will say is You don't necessarily have to answer every question. You don't necessarily have to answer it the way you would think to answer it. And so rather than answering a question, and this is certainly something Jesus does, right? Not necessarily answering a question the way that they would expect it to be answered, but Kukul will use the same tactic that Jesus has used in the scriptures, and that is not answering the question, asking another question, right? To try to get more information, to try to get some understanding about that. And that's one of the things that for me has been very helpful in all of this, in trying to understand logical problems and trying to understand people who make mistakes in terms of their logic. And I certainly make mistakes in terms of my logic too. I think we all do from time to time. Um, I can understand that I don't have to answer every question. I can defer some of those questions, or I can use questions to answer questions that they might have without directly answering the question. And so some of those things I think are helpful when we think about this particular situation of a logical fallacy, of alternatives that we might be presented with, and trying to deal with those particular situations. So there are a few things that we can probably do in terms of dealing with these sorts of things. And the first one I do want to say is be charitable with people. Try to be charitable with people. There are lots of people out there who don't understand certain things. I know myself, and I'm sure you have too, over the years, that you might have changed your opinion about something, or you might have come to a better understanding about something. And so, therefore, we need to be charitable with people that maybe they just don't understand. They're not of a mind to know all of the issues and answers that they need to deal with. So be charitable with people. Secondly, I would say right off the bat, be suspicious with people. And I'm not saying, go around and try to deal with things that way. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is realize that there are going to be people out there who are going to try to apply these particular techniques. In all three of those scenarios, well, actually, in the first, uh, second, and third one, there were some nefarious issues there. There were some people who were trying to cause problems, and because they were trying to cause problems, they ended up causing a logical fallacy or creating a logical fallacy. And so we need to be suspicious to the point where we recognize this particular situation. We understand it, we know what it is, and we see it for what it is. We see it for an opportunity that somebody is trying to create to force you to make decisions that you don't have to make. Learning Ladders, a group that talks about this sort of thing, says listen for language that suggests only two options, ignores alternatives, or dismisses the possibility of a middle ground. If someone presents a situation as either or and refuses nuance, chances are they're imposing a false dichotomy. The likelihood is that they're trying to get you into this particular situation, right? They're trying to pigeonhole you to make you think that you have to accept one or the other of those alternatives. And the problem is that's not necessarily the case. Don't accept this binary thinking that they're trying to impose on you. Evaluate also whether two of the alternatives could be true at the same time. Is it possible that we could be looking at a situation where maybe, just maybe, two of those alternatives will fit? For example, if the false dilemma suggests that your feelings towards someone can either be positive or negative, explain that it's possible to have mixed feelings. You understand what that means, right? We have mixed feelings sometimes about things, right? Sometimes we have mixed feelings about how to deal with our children. How do we discipline our children? How do we deal with them? Well, sometimes it's not always black and white. Sometimes we understand that we can have mixed feelings in that regard. And so we can accept the fact, again, that we're not necessarily talking about a black and white situation, a binary situation. And also show that there are more than just two alternatives, as we've already seen. And maybe even more than well, I said more than the two. I guess that would be enough to say more than the two, right? More than two. That would be something that we would be looking at, trying to understand. And if even if that person has already considered if there are other alternatives, we might want to try to press them into thinking about other alternatives. That's where Kukul might also come in, where you say, let that person help you understand what the alternatives are, rather than me saying, well, see, there's only two, you're only giving me two alternatives here. And he's saying, yes, you have to pick one of those two alternatives. Okay, I'm going to try to fit into one of those two alternatives. The reality is, then you help me explain how that happens. How does that work in this particular situation? How can you make those two alternatives work? Rather than me saying, well, I'll have to try to figure it out somehow for you. Recognize that you're dealing with a logical fallacy in an argument and work to expose it. You know, that's the reality of a lot of these things. There is false argumentation. Sometimes there's deliberate false argumentation. Sometimes we must expose that argumentation. We've seen that in our society tremendously these days, haven't we? You know, where we see people taking all sorts of liberties with logic and reasoning, and trying to make us fit into particular ideas about that reasoning. I mean, even Jesus had to deal with these types of arguments. We've seen that Jesus had to deal with these types of arguments and how he dealt with those types of arguments, which will help us in terms of when we come up with those things. We should be prepared to do the same sorts of things. Now, this is only one of many types of logical fallacies that we might deal with, but it's worth our time, I think, at least to read through and become familiar with these types of logical fallacies. There are some good websites out there that have documents that may be one page long that will say, these are your different logical fallacies, and try to become familiar with what they might be to some degree so that you can work against those logical fallacies. I want to conclude with this verse, and I know it's only loosely fitting at this point. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. But I think it does make sense to think about this because of the nature of reasoning and argumentation and that sort of thing. There, Peter says, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. You know, this is about the idea of apologia, the apology, the idea of giving a defense. That's the idea in this particular passage. And that is an idea that we need to be ready. We need to be prepared to some degree to do battle with people who are dealing in these particular ways of thinking. We may need to expose those people. We may need to deal with them in some particular way. And so I think in this particular verse, what we see is a readiness to be able to make those reasonings, to be able to help people to understand that these things exist. The reality is, if we don't think about these particular things, then we may be lost in how we deal with it, right? Somehow we don't have the strategies, we don't have the abilities. And so I think we do look at those things, and especially 1 Peter 3:15 will help us to understand that we need to be looking at those particular aspects. So hopefully that's been helpful in some way to you this morning. Hopefully I got through it, because I'm probably sure that there are things that I might be saying that are a little bit off. I can tell in my own mind that I'm not 100%. So hopefully I got through it in that respect. So certainly this morning, we want to encourage you, if you have need to respond to an invitation, we want to offer that invitation. If there's anything that we can do in any way, including myself, to help you to understand the truth in some way to a greater degree, to make that commitment to serving God for you and in your life, we certainly want to be able to do that. And if there is a need, we want to be able to make that need known as well. So if you need to do that, please come forward as we stand and sing.